Hi everyone, it's Thoughtful Beetle, and today I wanted to try something a little bit different and do a reaction video. And I think this is going to be pretty fun because it actually combines the subject matter of my previous two videos. The last one was on Jordan Peterson and why I think he's wrong about a lot of different things. And the one before that, I was talking with Sean Darling-Hammond about critical race theory and racism, systemic racism, issues like that. And I think this idea of systemic racism is very much important. It's something that we really need to address and consider in our society. And then on the subject of Jordan Peterson, I think Jordan Peterson is one of those people who lots of people think is very smart, think is very much worth listening to, and who I think is dead wrong about a lot of different things. So I found this short clip of Jordan Peterson. It's titled "The Fundamental Racist Idea." And this clip has over 1 million views. It has a very high like to dislike ratio. And it's a clip of Jordan giving a lecture and then presumably talking about what he views to be the fundamentally racist idea. Now, I haven't seen this clip before, so we'll see what it's like. And one other thing before I start and get into is that this clip is not from Jordan Peterson's official channel. This is from a separate channel called Dose of Truth. And I think that's important to remember before we even go into it because this might be missing some context. It's not necessarily formally endorsed by Jordan Peterson, even though it is him talking and it is just a clip of him giving this speech. So there could be additional context, there could be additional ideas. I'll link to both this video and if I can find it, the original lecture that Jordan gives in the description below. But I think it'd be really interesting to see what Jordan thinks is the fundamental racist idea and see where we might agree or disagree. So let's get into it.
I'm against poverty. You know, that's like classic protest sign. It's like, really? It's like, I'm against torture. It's like, it's so obvious. You don't get any brownie points for being against poverty. No one in their right mind is for poverty.
Okay. I should say I've watched a lot of different Jordan Peterson lectures before. And I don't know if I've actually watched this specific one. It's possible I may have. But this is a thing that Jordan does a lot. He brings this up over and over again. He says, there's a, I'm against poverty. And he kind of makes fun of this idea about how, if someone is saying they're against poverty or they're against torture or something like that, it's like, you know what? Everyone thinks that. What are you doing? What are you actually protesting here? Is what Jordan Peterson is saying. I think that's a pretty ridiculous point. And it's very much in line with what Jordan Peterson does all the time, which is he sets up straw men. So a straw man is basically when you set up an argument that is much weaker than the one that your opponent is making. And then you take down that argument that you set up, making it seem like, oh, you defeated that other person's argument. So it's called a straw man because instead of facing your real opponent, you have created an enemy out of straw, which is much easier to fight and defeat. Jordan does those things a lot, and this is a great example of that, where he's saying, there's people out there protesting, I'm against poverty. And it's like, okay, Jordan, like how many people are actually out there doing that who don't have an additional message? Who aren't saying, I'm against poverty, and then these systems perpetuate poverty, or I'm against poverty because, and then go into something different. Of course, Jordan, everyone doesn't like poverty, everyone doesn't like torture. You saying that is not a wise or novel thing to say. It really bothers me because he brings up this point a lot, and it always gets a laugh from the audience, and it's always something that Jordan gets righteously indignant about. And it's just silly, because it's a thing he made up, and that he is now saying is ridiculous. It's like, yeah, Jordan, you can make up ridiculous things.
You ever watch The Simpsons? You ever see the Republican Party in The Simpsons? They all meet in an old haunted castle at night with like lightning bolts going off, and there's a vampire and a crazy Texan. And even the Simpson Republicans don't sit around in the haunted tower at midnight saying, hey, we need more poverty.
Again, this is just such a straw man argument. And there is a kernel of truth to what Jordan is saying, which again is why I think he's also so popular and people think he's so smart and listen to him, because he'll add in this little bit of truth for something where you're like, oh, he is making a good point. And then he sort of like builds off of it to form this really ridiculous, nonsensical point. And so what I see as the problem here is that Jordan Peterson is saying like, the Republican Party isn't just, a bunch of crazy people sitting in a tower wanting to make more poor people, And it's like, of course you're right, Jordan. And if people think that the Republican Party is that, or like, different Republican leaders are that, they are, of course, wrong. I mean, people don't just sit around devising new ways to make other people unhappy. anyone who's seriously trying to address arguments understands that and knows that. So Jordan, again, is not saying anything novel here. But again, he's kind of missing the point, which is that, say, people who are protesting, I'm against poverty for different reasons, or I'm against policies that are out there that I see as increasing poverty, would go about attacking the policies, would go about attacking those different ideas, and then hopefully would not be saying, wow, those people are very much intentionally trying to cause poverty because they're evil. They're saying those people are causing poverty through their actions and we need to fix that. So again, Jordan is setting up a scenario that's just ridiculous, that's very easy to take down, and that does not represent what people who are serious about these issues actually think. It doesn't really represent anybody.
Here's an interesting thing. So one of the postmodernist claims is that diversity is necessary. And they make it racial, and they make it sexual, and they make it ethnic, and all of that. That's actually technically incorrect, by the way, because I study individual differences. So those are the differences between people. And I know the literature. So you know about James Damore's memo, right, from Google. He wrote that partly because he was watching my videos, which is why he wanted me to interview him. And I'm a believer that there are biological differences in temperament between men and women, apart from the other obvious differences, and that they're actually not trivial. And that they maximize in the societies that have moved farthest to producing egalitarian states, the Scandinavian countries, and that the reason for that is that there's two reasons why men and women differ in temperament. One is biological and the other is environmental. And if you remove the environmental variation, which you do if you make the state egalitarian, you maximize the genetic variation. And that's been demonstrated in the scientific literature over about 4 decades. And no one wanted it or hoped for it, and they weren't biased in looking for it because that was exactly the opposite of what social scientists wanted to find.
So really quick, again, one of the reasons why Jordan Peterson is so much looked up to as an intellectual titan, oftentimes by people on the right, is because he does actually have some scientific credentials. He used to be a clinical psychologist, and he does know the literature pretty well. So generally speaking, because I am not a clinical psychologist, I have read some of these things, but generally speaking, on the factual baseline level, I defer to what Jordan Peterson is saying. And while you should certainly look it up for yourself, that generally speaking seems to be a decent assumption as well. However, I have not looked into it deeply on my own. So it'll be interesting to see where he goes with this.
The social scientists lean heavily to the left, and what they wanted to find was you flatten out the state so that everyone has equal opportunity and the differences between people disappear. That is not what happened. The opposite happened. That was wrong, and no one was happy about it. And no one's happy about it now. You can actually tell when you've discovered something in a social science, because you're not happy about it. But if you take, let's say, there's a big difference between men and women in terms of trait agreeableness, compassion and politeness. On average, women are more agreeable than men.
I want to pause this really quick just because we're over halfway through the video and we haven't really touched on racism yet. It's mostly been a sort of argument about sexism. And he hasn't really got to the point either, so there hasn't been a lot to say, but let's see where he goes with it.
And the difference is approximately this. If you take random pairs of men and women out of the population, let's say you had to make a bet on who was more agreeable. If you bet that it was the woman, you'd be right 60% of the time. Well, that's not that much. It means you'd be wrong 40% of the time. That's almost 50% of the time. So this is a big difference by social science standards, but that's the magnitude of the difference. There are some differences that are bigger, like the difference between men and women's interest in people versus things is actually bigger than that. That's the biggest difference we know.
So this is actually, I think, something that's important that Jordan Peterson is talking about here, which kind of cuts both ways with this idea that, there are no differences between sexes, or this sort of idea that everything is absolutely the same. And that what I think Jordan Peterson is pointing out here is that there are actually some differences that can be measured by social sciences. And yes, as far as I'm aware, that is true. What he's also pointing out, though, is that those differences aren't massive necessarily. They're statistically significant. There are things that are there. But again, it's like, on average, a thing is true. On average, a thing is not true. And of course, there will always be outliers. And I shouldn't say outliers because that implies that something is very much statistically significantly different. What this is saying basically is that, yes, the average might be different, but there's still lots of room for variation and a huge amount of overlap in the middle. And so this, of course, sort of gets back to the idea that if you're saying, women are this way, men are this way, it's just like, if you actually look at it, there's a colossal amount of overlap, even if the averages may be skewed off a little bit. So saying that just like they're two totally different things is wrong. But on the other hand, it would also be incorrect to say that there aren't some statistically significant differences between men and women. So this is something important that Jordan Peterson brings up, and I think he is right to point it out, and how it cuts both ways, to both sides of the argument.
But it's a big difference, let's say, the agreeableness difference, but still, the shared attributes of men and women far outweigh the attributes that differentiate them. Because you could ask, are there more differences within groups or between them? Now, the postmodern answer to that is between them.
So that's interesting. Jordan often calls a lot of people postmodernists when a lot of people do not identify themselves as postmodernists, which is, again, something that Jordan does. Postmodernism is quite a broad topic to be going into now, but it's kind of Jordan Peterson's boogeyman of people who are denying tradition, who are saying that these different societal structures and stuff that have been built up over time are meaningless, and what have you. So it's always difficult because Jordan Peterson will say the other side, the postmodernists, say this, and when you actually look into it, very infrequently as any amount of people actually saying what Jordan Peterson says they are saying. So this idea that he's correct, that if you're looking at different groups of people, different races of people, race is really a social construct. And the fact of the matter is that if you're looking at differences within the groups, like within racial groups, compared to differences between the racial groups, the differences within the groups is much bigger than the differences outside of the groups. That is, yes, a well-established fact, and something that lots of people who be proponents of critical race theory, things like that, readily admit, and is kind of like a baseline premise of a lot of things that they're saying. So it's really interesting to see Jordan Peterson say, the postmodernists, the people that I'm opposed to, they don't think that is true. When, in my experience, and from hearing what other people say who Jordan Peterson would disagree with on these issues, they do in fact agree with him on this point. So it's always tough when Jordan Peterson is saying the other side doesn't think this, because oftentimes they'll actually agree with him.
That's why you need diversity. By group, right? That's why you need different races. That's why you need different ethnicities and sexual preferences and all of that.
Okay, so this is also important because I feel like Jordan Peterson is again setting up this straw man argument, which seems on its face to make a lot of sense, and that's why it's so easy to accept. I'm going to let it go just a little bit longer, and then I want to sort of circle back to this idea.
Well, that's wrong. There's more difference within the groups than there is between them. You don't get diversity by crossing the groups. You get diversity by selecting across individuals. In fact, the idea that there is more differences between groups than there is between individuals is actually the fundamental racist idea.
Okay, so what Jordan Peterson is saying here is that there are more differences within groups than there are between groups. And that is, as far as I can tell, a pretty well accepted fact by basically everyone except for hardcore racists. So that's something that people would agree with him on. But then he's saying that postmodernists, or these other people who value this idea of diversity, are saying that the differences between people are greater between groups than within groups. Now, what Jordan Peterson is doing here is he's setting up this argument that you're like, wow, no, that logically follows. I mean, of course, yes, there's more diversity within groups than there are between groups. But wait a minute. These people who are into social justice are saying we need different groups. How can they think that unless they think that the differences between groups are greater than the differences within groups? And if they think that, isn't that the fundamentally racist idea, like what he's saying? Yes, that seems to make sense. That seems to logically follow. The problem here is the way Jordan Peterson is setting it up is missing the actual point of people saying that diversity is a good thing. And let me try to illustrate why that might be a thing. So let's just say that someone had the exact same agreeableness. Like that's a trait that Jordan was talking about earlier. Like, agreeableness, and another one he mentioned was like interest in people versus things. Let's say a person had the same scores on those two personality traits, right? Or just say they had the same scores across all personality traits, that they were, functionally in that regard the same person. Yet they had a very different lived experience. That one of them had grown up in a system that was geared towards and favored them in many ways, and another had grown up in a system that was not. the basic question is, if two people have the same traits, does that make them the same person? Does that mean that their experiences will lead them to the same conclusions? And does that mean that their lived experience will then turn out to be exactly the same? And the answer, of course, is no. So what people who are arguing for diversity being a strength are actually arguing is not the idea that these sort of inherent genetic traits within these groups are so much different between the groups. They're not arguing that, like, between group diversity is greater than in-group diversity for those traits. What they are arguing is that the lived experiences and the perspectives that people bring because of their lived experiences are going to be different. And that's separate from this idea of these are the genetic predispositions that you have. It's like you can have the same genetic predispositions, and then because your life is very different due to social and historical pressures, you can end up being a very different person who perceives things in a very different way. So that's the whole idea with this idea of like why diversity is important. It's not saying that your genetic predispositions are going to be all that different. It's saying that your experiences in life and the things you've gained for that and the perspectives you bring, which is unrelated predominantly to your genetic predisposition, is going to be different. So that's the problem with what Jordan is setting up here, is that he sets up this thing that seems to very much logically follow, but again, he set up a straw man because he set up this argument that people aren't making. They aren't saying that these genetic changes, these genetic differences are what make diversity. They're saying that people's lived experience is what's making diversity. So he's entirely missed that point.
It's the fundamental racist idea, which is, well, let's say you're Asian, Oriental, to use the old word to discriminate the one type of Asian, say, from the other.
Hey, that's me, or half of me. I'm the half Asian Oriental. So let's say this applies to me. We'll see what he's saying. You're Asian, you're Oriental.
You're so different from me that there's no overlap between our groups. And you're also so different, and there's so little difference within your group that now that I know that you're not me, you're not one of mine, I actually know what you're like. No. Technically, that's incorrect. That's wrong. That isn't how you get diversity.
Okay, so that's the end of the video. The problem here again is that Jordan is he's setting up the system where he's saying, like, this is what other people are saying. This is what they mean. And therefore, this is why they're wrong. And the simple fact of the matter is that's not what other people are saying. And that's not what they mean. And it is so frustrating to see someone like Jordan, who should know better, who is well-educated, who has studied these things, who goes out, who talks with and debates with people, simply getting it wrong, what other people are thinking and what their views are. So when he's saying this idea, like, say you're Asian, then like, we say, well, look, you're so different than the other groups. Say, being black or white or Hispanic or what have you. You obviously have no overlap between them. Well, Jordan, no one is saying that. No one thinks that is true. And again, certainly nobody thinks that's true on this genetic level with what you are genetically predisposed to, your different character traits that can be determined by genetics. It is certainly not on that level. In terms of like how it actually is somewhat true, it's how your lived experience has shaped things. And again, that's not really based on genetics, that's based on the social structures that exist. So for someone, say, like me, who is half Asian, my mom is fully Asian, and there is a very different lived experience for people in the United States who are Asian as opposed to people who are white, as opposed to people who are Hispanic, as opposed to people who are black on average. Again, it's not one of those things like there is no overlap, never the two shall meet. No, of course not. But there are differences, and there's different ways that those people are likely to perceive things because of historical and societal changes that have shaped the way these different races are viewed. Because again, races aren't about this predisposition at a genetic level. Race is socially constructed. We can pick based just about anything to say, now you are a different race, now you are this other race. And we have, and racism has changed through history. It's like, what did white mean? What does black mean? It changes over time. And so Jordan making these arguments really is just silly. It's really unfortunate to see him take all this time to set up this argument, which I can see why people will think it's logical, because he sets up this idea that is true, that the differences between groups are much smaller than the differences within groups when it comes to genetic predispositions to things. He's completely correct about that, and that's a very important thing that undermines a lot of the ideas about classical racism. But then he takes this idea and says, you know, these other people who are into social justice, who are into critical race theory, who are into things like that, they don't think that's true. They think the differences are greater. Again, no one's saying that. So he sets up this straw man argument, he knocks down the straw man easily, and he struts off proclaiming victory. Well, Jordan, that's not what anybody was arguing. You've completely missed the point. So those are my thoughts on this idea from Jordan Peterson about the fundamentally racist idea. But I would love to know what you think. Do you think Jordan Peterson is right about this? Do you think he's correct that people actually view racism in this way, and that it is about the genetic predispositions of people that makes them different, and that's why diversity is our strength? Do you think I've missed something else? Do you think I'm totally off the mark? I'd love to know. Please let me know what your thoughts are, and I'll see you next time.